Final Fantasy 16 looks like the end of Final Fantasy. Like, it is remarkable to me how Square Enix can throw out a new Final Fantasy out of nowhere, and no one is excited about it, no one is talking about it, no one cares at all. After the disaster that was Final Fantasy 15 and the terrible remake that was 7, people have no faith in Square Enix to deliver. Final Fantasy as a brand is dead, and it has been since 2001, since Final Fantasy X was released, right? Like, Final Fantasy X, as far as I'm concerned, is the last Final Fantasy game, and that's a fine way to end it. Like, I'm happy with what we have. It had a good run, a solid franchise, but they have to keep putting out new ones, and they keep getting worse. And as a result, we get shit like Final Fantasy 12, Final Fantasy 13, the 13 trilogy, 10-2. We get the original release of the MMO, Final Fantasy 14, and now we have the terrible Final Fantasy 15. We have the upcoming parts to Final Fantasy 7R, and we have Final Fantasy 16. Oh, by the way, is it just me? Has no one seriously discussed at all how Square Enix is somehow going to balance putting out an entirely new Final Fantasy while balancing the release schedule for Final Fantasy 7R, like Episode 2? Like, why are the people who religiously insisted that Final Fantasy 7R was a good game, why is no one fired up about a Part 2? Because, really, when you get right down to it, the only reason that anyone defended Final Fantasy 7R was because of blind fanboyism. That's the only reason why. People only defended that piece of shit because, like, oh, it's Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII can't be bad. It's one of the most iconic video games of all time. You know what? Like, I recently just got through, like, looking at an IGN list of a bunch of, like, some of the all-time best NES games, and I noticed that a lot of kids' cartoons licensed games were there that I don't think really held up as well as something like, Super Mario Bros., Metroid, Zelda, things like that. Like, it feels like a bunch of people who played Final Fantasy VII when they were kids and have this, like, this obsession with it, this fixation on it, like, are unwilling to admit as adults that the game isn't the best thing ever. Like, that the creators... that the current creators, I should say, don't know what they're doing. Square Enix doesn't know how to handle the brand. They've been making pointless retcons for years. They've been doing all this stuff, and nobody seems to be addressing it. Like, it felt like to me, when it came to Final Fantasy 7R, that it was a really weird situation in which new fans weren't getting into it because Final Fantasy 7R was a piece of shit, and old fans were getting into it because Final Fantasy 7R was a piece of shit that didn't respect the source material, while game journalists, the shills, the YouTubers, the Angry Joes of the world, the Maximilian dudes, those people insisted the game was great, insisted it was fantastic, insisted it was wonderful, and now it feels like the game is basically completely forgotten. Like, 6 months later, like, it's just basically completely forgotten. No one's excited about a Part 2. No one's talking about a Part 2. Square Enix hasn't said anything about it. No one's optimistic about it whatsoever. And Final Fantasy 16... this is the least hyped I think I've been about a Final Fantasy remake ever. When I saw a remake, I was just like, okay, this is going to be shit. And it was kind of like an escalation for me. Like, okay, first of all, it was like, oh, they fucked up the combat system. Oh, they're just pandering to nostalgia. This shouldn't be a major deal, but they're treating it. They're doing a complete overhaul of everything. They're making it episodic. There were so many red flags with that one, right? But it wasn't immediately clear what was wrong with that game from the onset. But with 16, we have this really generic sort of storyline. We have these terrible looking characters, terrible looking combat, like very 15 looking ish. They can't get away from the action based combat that nobody actually likes. Like, they just slap action game combat onto there. Like, all they have to do, like, make it turn-based, but, like, make it like Chrono Trigger, where it's in, like, the open space. Like, why do they feel the need to make it action? Like, it doesn't suit Final Fantasy like at all, and I think it's really limiting like what made the original games good. Like they just, it's so frustrating. I so strongly dislike what they're doing here. There was absolutely nothing that interested me about Final Fantasy 16, like other than the fact that it was honestly, like I was more interested in that like disclaimer at the beginning of the video, in which Square Enix like confirmed that like, oh, by the way, we're showing this running on a PC, which kind of just proves that Final Fantasy 16 is that PS5 isn't that much more powerful than a PS4, but it's bad. Like, Square Enix is in a really bad situation right now. Like, I don't know how much longer they can keep this up. Like, are people going to get, like, are people going to be interested in Athia or any of these other things? Like, I don't think so. Like, I think what they're trying to do is, like, they're trying to go for the PC audience. They're trying to do this stuff. They're trying to do everything. I don't know. I don't expect Final Fantasy 16 is going to be all that well received. I think there's going to be a bunch of people who sort of, again, it's going to be like every other Final Fantasy release. I think what Square is trying to do is like trying to appeal to like older fans. I think they're going for like the Witcher audience. They're doing things like that. So maybe Witcher fanboys will get into it. But I expect this is going to be one of those titles that alienates like the core fans, you know, actual Japanese RPG fans, like fans of real video games, even further. You know what I mean? Like, maybe people like Angry Joe will like it, but I think the actual audience, the core demographic, is not going to care for this at all. Like, it just doesn't look like Final Fantasy. Like, I said this about, like, 15, 13, 12, but it's not Final Fantasy anymore, and that really needs to be acknowledged more often in the community. Final Fantasy as a brand is dead, and you should not support the copycat that has taken its place.